House Judiciary Committee meeting. We've got two matters on for discussion today and consideration. I have got a bill that I'll be presenting in a Senate meeting, and I'm going to leave in a moment and turn it over to Representative Fleming to conduct the meeting until I return. I'd like to recognize Judge Lawton Stevens. We're so pleased to have you with us today, and I see Commissioner Lynn Riley with Department of Revenue here. We're always pleased to see you too, Lynn. Any judiciary we've missed? Elected officials? Well, thank you for being here. What I'll do, Representative Fleming, is turn it over to you, and I'll be back hopefully in about 10, 15 minutes. All right. We'll see how quick I can convince them.
Okay, first up today we have SB 130. Senator Tillery, come on forward. Welcome. Good to see you today. Tell us about Senate Bill 130.
Senate Bill 130, let me make sure we're all looking. I got this up to you just a second ago. It's LC 411140S. My understanding is this actually passed out of the House last year. Representative Strickland was carrying it at the time. It does two simple things. The original bill we passed included if someone wanted to waive an attorney, they had to do that knowingly, voluntarily, and on the record. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Knowingly, voluntarily, and on the record. The knowingly and voluntarily is already case law. The on the record was just something that came in a footnote in a case by the Court of Appeals this year, and that's where that came from. What's been added now in the substitute is what was Senate Bill 131. It passed the Judiciary Committee unanimously.
And real quick, Senator. So
yes, sir.
The part, are you part 3? Part 2? What would you just describe to us?
I talked to you about parts 2 and 3.
2 and 3, okay.
Yes, sir.
And you said, so parts 2 and 3 was the original SB 130.
Correct.
And that is also something you're saying that Representative Strickland carried last year and we passed?
The whole bill was carried last year is my understanding, and
right.
It passed the House. It just didn't make it through the Senate before sine die.
And this is when there's a, I see disposition of children mentioned in here. Are we talking about just cases involving kids? Is that what we're talking about?
Which section are you talking about, 2 and 3?
I'm with you on 2 and 3 now.
Okay. 2 and 3 is when you're waiving an attorney in a juvenile court proceeding.
In a juvenile court proceeding.
Yes,
okay.
sir. Section 2 deals when adults are waiving the attorney.
Okay.
That must be done knowingly, voluntarily, and on the record. The on the record is the only add, as to case law already had the knowingly and voluntarily.
Okay.
Section 3 is when a child can waive. A child can waive again knowingly, voluntarily, and on the record, but only if their liberty is not in jeopardy.
Okay.
Which was already the law as before.
So I guess this passed the House last year, as far as you know.
As far as I'm aware, yes, sir. Just didn't make it through by sine die, so that's added on to come through again this year on hopefully get through the House by sine die.
Once again, we let a senator carry it and hope it gets done. Is that what it is? Okay.
No, sir. What you did is you let a senator carry it, then you brought it to the House committee to perfect.
Oh, okay.
Now you're hoping it can get done.
All right. Boy, this guy learns quick, doesn't he?
So,
yeah, he's sharp. All right, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No,
I just want to make
fine.
sure I had the right. So those are the original Senate Bill 130, and then you're about to, when I interrupted you, tell us about Section 1. Probably,
Section 1 is the add by the committee, the perfection, as we'll call it. What it does is adds what Senate Bill 131 originally was. It was a if we're going to terminate parental rights, well, basically, if we have an adoption proceeding, that adoption proceeding will be stayed until the termination of parental rights. We've ended up with some instances in this state where we've had differing rulings. So the adoption goes through, the parental rights are actually restored on appeal, and we have to go back and then strip the adoption. And what this is hopefully trying to do is make sure that we don't have to go through that situation.
Okay. Now, did Senate Bill 131 make it through the process?
It made it through committee. It was sitting on rules on crossover day and didn't make it out of rules.
So it made it through the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Yes, sir.
It didn't make it through Senate rules.
Correct.
So we're taking that and putting it on there. Okay. All right. I think we already have one question for you. Is that Representative Oliver? Representative Oliver?
I remember Section 2 and 3 from last year, and I'm good with that. Section 1 did not pass last year. That's new this year.
Okay.
Am I correct?
I believe it passed last year, but I would defer to your wisdom. You were here and I was
I
not.
don't remember it, but
Mr. Sewell, you want to comment on that?
Last year, it started,
Press one of those buttons over there, Rusty, and we'll turn your mic on for you. There you go. Go ahead. Please identify yourself for everybody that doesn't know you.
my name is Rusty Sewell. I represent the state bar. And last year, Representative Strickland carried this bill, and all three sections were in the bill. It actually went through juvenile justice. It was assigned to juvenile justice, which I think you're on too.
Right.
It went through that committee with no changes. Went over to the Senate and went to special duty in the Senate. It was actually introduced a little late in the session. It went through special duty in the Senate and passed out of there and just didn't make it on the calendar on the 39th day in the Senate. But it had both in there.
Okay, thank you. I just don't remember section 1. What I'm remembering, and this is what's confusing me, is that I thought we passed something maybe 5 years ago that accelerated appeals of adoptions in the Supreme Court. The concern, the issue was delaying the limbo for the child, and there was some interest in making the adoption orders move faster. And then and I'm saying all this to remind myself, in the meantime, we have this confusion about what's state and what's not state.
Yes, ma'am.
But
And that.
I'm not sure I'm
sorry.
remembering all that correctly.
Well, I'm glad you actually brought that up, because when I was asked originally to carry this bill, that was one of my first questions and concerns. Where I ended up coming down on, and I understand where we could actually delay an adoption, we delay the placement of a child because we're waiting on an appeal. But what we're really doing here is we're weighing the cost of uncertainty in favor of finality. And in that case, I thought that finality sort of won out, at least in my balance scales. So.
Does anybody know how we're treating adoptions or terminations of parental rights on appeals in terms of accelerated results, or does anybody know what the status of that is now? Because I don't remember. And is it by discretion? That's what I can't remember. But I don't know. I'm overly confusing this perhaps, because as I understand what you're doing in section 1 is to make consistent the Court of Appeals decisions on what is stayed and what goes forward. Is that correct?
Well, let me see if I can do a better job of explaining it, and perhaps that's where I failed you. Is that if we have a decision on an adoption, and that adoption, I guess the parental rights have to be determined for that adoption to move forward. And what we were wanting to make sure of now is that if a parent appeals that termination, that we don't have a decision where we've adopted that child to you or to some other parent, but on appeal the parental rights are restored, so we then have to come back and strike the adoption.
The adoption's going through Superior Court. The parental rights is going through Juvenile Court. But it doesn't make any sense that they would have granted an adoption if the termination of parental rights is still out there. But I'm not going to hold this bill up. I just don't know that I need to understand it. But who else can explain?
Chairman Welch, you want to press your button and I'll turn your mic on.
And then I noticed here, just following up on what Representative Aller was saying, that in lines 19 through 21, it says, except for proceedings in connection with the adoption, the court shall continue to conduct hearings. So, in accordance with the chapter, I'm not sure if that is resolving the issue that you're talking about with termination or not. I just was reading that and thought.
But the only way this would make sense is you have a termination. It would be that they're in two different courts. Am I right? So the adoption's going forward in Superior Court. It's been granted after the termination has been granted, and then in the 30-day period the parent appeals the termination. Is that what happens? Is that the procedure?
Judge Stevens, you're sitting out there. Can you shed any light on any of this for us?
Occasions where we would terminate.
Termination
Right.
too.
But how can you have that would be in one court order?
Well, if you have to terminate them, it's part of the adoption. It's in the same court.
Yeah. So why would
Representative Oliver, I think what is happening is you're going to an appellate court at that point in time. And so if the appellate court reverses the decision of the either the juvenile court, or in this case it could possibly be the Superior Court, then we would have to go back and also strike the adoption that was done as well in the Superior Court. And what this bill seeks to do is to stay that adoption until the appellate court has made a determination on the parental rights.
That means leave the child with the adoptive parents, what it means, I think. And maybe that's the goal of this bill, is to not make the child move back to the parents if the child has already been with the adopted parents. Maybe that's the purpose. That's the policy we're deciding, it sounds like.
I don't know. Possibly, it could be the reverse, because what we're saying is we're not going to allow those. They may at that time be foster parents. Actually, we're not going to make them adoptive parents at that point in time until the final adjudication of the parental rights. Because upon the final adjudication of parental rights, then we will make them adoptive parents, not allow that adoptive parent title to be stripped.
But 1921 allows them to move the child around. What I read.
I don't know that I answered your question.
If I get an adoption, it's after the juvenile court's already terminated.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm.
In general, I mean, if there's a case, if it's on appeal, then the appeal acts as a supersede to the court's order anyway. So I think this just makes explicit what the bill has said, and it is a supersede.
And this applies to the termination proceedings in juvenile court, so it's an appeal from
Termination proceedings are appealed out of juvenile court, and then you don't want to
Directly.
adoption until after that's been.
That's right.
Correct.
Yes, I mean, if you read this, and the way I'm reading it in the code section is that when the cases when you've had a final determination on the parental rights and you've terminated those, an appeal can be sought to the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, and then from that point forward, any attempt to any adoption proceedings would be stayed until that issue is resolved and comes back. That's the way I'm reading it. So it seems like it works logically with how you'd want the appellate process to work before you performed an adoption. You'd want to make sure that all appeals or legal concerns regarding termination were brought to finality before you proceed with adoption. Otherwise, you're transferring the child to the adoptive parents, and then you may be taking the child away later on.
How's that suit you, Miss?
What happens is the judges have to come and say, oh man, I messed up.
That's right.
What do you think, Representative Oliver?
I think that most adoptions are out of defects are foster care or parent adoptions. It's 75-80%, something like that. So in those cases where I just don't want to move in the child. That's what I don't want. And I think this clarifies that more than not. Even though 19 to 21 allows them to move the child, I think you're right. The fact that the adoption is not finalized.
This is just in the instance where there's contested termination.
Right.
Okay. Any other questions of Senator? I don't think we have anybody signed up on this one. Is anybody here to speak to Senate Bill 130, which now contains Senate Bill 131? Going once, going twice, gone. Okay, Senator, thank you so much. We appreciate you bringing this to us today.
Thank you.
We'll now bring the bill back to the committee. Any further comments before the chair accepts a motion? Questions? Hearing none, is there a motion regarding LC 411140S substitute to SB 130?
Move to pass.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Move on to rules. Do pass by substitute, that's correct. Thank you, Senator.
Thank y'all.
Appreciate it. Good to see you. All right, Senator Kennedy. You promise your bills is this simple?
Well, rumor has it it's not, Mr. Chairman. I thought it was. Thought we had a simple little bill for a change.
Who is your, Blake Tillery?
And you can speak to that.
Is Senator Tillery already gone out there? If he's in the hallway, if he's run off, don't worry about it. We're just gonna ask him who his house sponsor was. Yeah. Do you know who your house sponsor is, Senator? Brian Strickland is? Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Okay. Senator Kennedy, you
Yes,
doing
sir.
all right today?
I'm well, Mr. Chairman. I hope you
good
are.
good to see you.
No, nice to see you.
You got somebody better looking than you with you. Who is that?
Yes, sir. This is Miss Deborah Nesbitt.
Deborah, good to see you again today. Good to
Deborah
see you.
Nesbitt, ACCG.
Absolutely. And I guess before I forget to ask it, who's carrying SB 222 for you in the House? Do you know?
Alan Powell.
Alan Powell. Okay. Chairman Powell. Chairman Alan Powell. All righty. Senator Kennedy, I think you've already been through subcommittee, but there was no vote taken. Is that the posture that we were in?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think
Okay,
that's right.
Okay.
Mhm.
So why don't you go ahead and take over and tell us about Senate Bill 222?
Thank you, Mr.
All
Chairman.
right.
I appreciate the chance to present this to you. And I'm going to give just a brief overview, and then, if with your permission, turn it over to Ms. Nesbitt
Absolutely.
to give greater detail. But in essence, what Senate Bill 222 is a culmination of 2 years' worth of negotiations between the county and city governments concerning 911 centers in the telecommunications industry. The state's 911 services provide a patchwork, or provided by a patchwork of 142 county and city governments with no real coordination or standards. The lack of those standards means that telecom providers have to cut multiple checks, and just to say it in simple terms, it's sort of an accounting mess and an accounting nightmare. There are also some inconsistencies with charges, currently different rates for different types of phone customers, and we need parity set forth there, and that's accounted for in the bill. And also because of some existing vague and ambiguous language in the statute as it has resulted in some litigation between the utilities and the counties. And so this bill would hopefully resolve that and take care of that. It creates a local 911 authority that coordinates the introduction of next generation 911 service, which is important overall for our state and for public safety. Updates the code in many ways with regard to certain fees, brings parity to the 911 fee so that all customers in Georgia now will be paying the same amount, and also brings some common sense to the way those fees are collected and remitted. And with that, I'll ask Ms. Nesbitt to maybe jump in and give some details, further details that the committee might want to hear from, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Some of you were in the previous committee meeting, and so do you want me to go section by section or just
I
give
think
you
so,
an
since-
overview?
Well, what you feel is necessary to explain what we're wanting to accomplish
Okay.
with this change. And yes, there was one committee meeting as far as a subcommittee, but we decided because of time, go ahead
Right.
and bring it to full committee.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, yes, ma'am.
Just a
Recognize
point of
you.
clar, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of clarifications. The members just got a pretty lengthy substitute, and I want to know if you've had a chance to look at it and if that's what you're going to be explaining or if you're going to be
I had a
explaining the
copy of
bill.
a substitute from yesterday, but I have not seen that substitute. And
She
I
has,
don't,
yeah,
and I
there's,
don't think Senator Kennedy has gotten either one.
I have not.
no,
When?
hold on. Yeah, the one you have given out is a substitute prepared by Representative Welch.
Okay.
And that's just what we'll get into as far as discussions.
I just want to make sure, is that what they're going to?
No, I was
No.
going to go through the original
You went
bill
through
as
the
passed
original?
by the Senate.
The original bill is SB 222/FA.
Do you have that in your folder?
You do.
I do, yeah. I'm just wondering of the utility of going through an old bill if it's largely superseded. I think
Is what?
if it's superseded by the substitute.
Not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
We have a substitute that could be under consideration if the committee wishes to consider that.
And so it'll be explained at a later time.
Right, right.
Okay. Thank
Right,
you.
right.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. For really more than 2 years, ACCG, GMA, the Sheriff's Association, the telecom industry, the cable industry, county attorneys, county managers, and members of our board had a stakeholder group that met quite frequently, and it was a long and painful process over 2 years' time to come up with this legislation, and that would be the original as-passed version from the Senate. There was a lot of negotiation. There was a really delicate and fine balance of language and definitions and trade-offs and you know, to come to this, to come to a consensus on this bill, something that everyone could live with. So we have, as Senator Kennedy indicated, we do have a patchwork of systems around the state. Each county runs their own local 911 center, and there are 23 cities that also run a 911 center. And each of those are independent. They levy the 911 fee, and that fee is sent to those 911 centers for operation. And the money can only be used for the operation of 911 centers as it is in current law. So what we came up with was coming up with a local 911 authority. Up until this point, and still today, the telecom providers and cable providers are cutting a check to every single PSAP every single month. As you can imagine, that's an administrative nightmare, not only for them to administer and send out, but for counties to track, or 911 centers to track if they're getting all the money they should be getting. And there virtually are no audits done in the state of the telecom providers to find out if they're remitting the money, and that if all the cable VoIP, voice over internet providers, that would be your phone service through a cable company, are even registered and paying 911 fees. There are a large number of very small VoIP providers around the state providing services and not paying any 911 fee for those lines. So the statute has not been updated since the 70s, and what we try to do is go in and update it to reflect today's technologies and make it more current. So in Section 1, it just sets up the local government 911 authority and sets up a board of directors that includes 911 directors, counties, sheriffs, all of the people that run public safety answering points, which are 911 centers, are on the board, and that's all that's on the board, are the people who actually operate the 911 centers. So the first section really just lays out the foundation and the structure of the authority, which tracks other authorities in state law. I did prepare an amendment that is in your folders as well to answer some of the questions that came up at subcommittee. Would the employees of this authority be state employees? No, they don't have to be. So I tried to answer those questions, and we tried to put clarifying language in the amendment for the bill so that that's more clear.
What is that amendment you're speaking of?
It's right. It's in your folder.
I don't.
Yes, it says
Amendment,
we
okay.
did this at our
all right,
office.
gotcha.
Yes.
Want to be sure identified.
So it really just sets up the authority, and what the authority's purpose is to collect or contract or have an accounting firm collect and remit all of the 911 fees in a central location. So for the telecoms, that gives them, they can send one check along with a report as to where the fees should be distributed back to once a month to the authority, and the authority immediately turns around and sends that back out to the 911 centers. Most important, it provides for an auditing, so that the authority would then go and audit the telecom providers to make sure they're remitting the proper amounts, and they would do that once every 3 years. The authorities, it gives the authority enforcement power. Right now, there is no enforcement power regarding the payment of these 911 fees. There is not a statewide entity umbrella to coordinate any 911 activities, apply for federal grants, or any of those things that typically a statewide entity would provide. And so it is a local government service. It is funded by a fee imposed at the local government level, and the 911 centers are run and funded by local government. And so we wanted those people to be the ones that are on the board that are coordinating statewide activities to make sure that there's interoperability between the 911 centers across county lines, and to assist in coming together to do MOUs with neighboring counties for that purpose. The authority, we had in the legislation that the authority could retain up to 3%, not a full 3%, but up to 3%, to pay for the administration of their activities, to pay for audits, and other things that the board may decide they want to provide for 911 centers. We really, because there is no central umbrella agency or repository for data, we really don't have any data on 911. If you go to the FCC website and pull up Georgia, there's big fat zeros all the way across, because there has been nobody at a state level that has collected any data regarding 911. What kind of systems are in each PSAP, how much money is generated, how much they cost. We gathered some information through a survey, but that was just a survey. It's not anything official. So that would be the other benefit to this local government authority, is that they would be required to give you, the General Assembly, a report every year of the funding that they received and how they're operating and what the status of 911 is in the state. So you, the General Assembly, would get that report. The bill goes into effect beginning January 1, 2019. That gives another legislative session for us to look at the bill and make sure that it's going to work properly. That's the beginning date for the collection and remittance of the fees. The board actually takes its seat 6 months earlier so that they can do planning for beginning to collect and remit those fees. So they will be seated 6 months prior to the beginning of the actual function of the authority. In this legislation, there are penalties that are assessed for failure to pay the 911 fees by the providers, failure to register if you're a provider and should be paying and you don't, or you haven't been registered. It lays out penalties, puts in an enforcement mechanism, and they will follow the Administrative Procedures Act in any actions that they take or enforcement of those requirements. And I'm just kind of briefly going through here because I know that we have folks from the telecom industry here, and we have 911 directors here that can go into more detail and questions for you as we go through the bill. The authority will be set up like other state authorities. However, they will not be state employees. They will not be a part of the retirement system. You, as the legislature, would have to actually pass an act that allowed that in order for that to happen. The only reason that we referenced the other authorities in there was so that the Attorney General could provide assistance to this authority like they do some of the other state authorities.
Yes.
I was writing down questions as we went, but you will tell us where this reference to the Attorney General is in the bill.
Yes, sir. It is lines 332 through 341.
Let her finish, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
I'm
All right.
writing down my questions. I just came out
Do the
without
same
me
thing.
thinking. All right.
Then the next, on page 11, I'm just going through the bill and hitting the highlights, but this really is the, one of the important parts of the bill. Are some updated definitions that better reflect technology today and how telephone lines are counted and charged the 911 fee. This is at the center of the litigation between the counties and the Barnes Law Firm regarding fees that have not been paid. There was the needed clarity in the law in order to decide how many they needed to pay. There's a difference between an active line, an active and enabled line, and just a number that's reserved in the event that you need to use it. And so we are updated the definition so that only the active and enabled lines are charged a 911 fee, and only the ones that can access the outside, that can do an outside call. For example, in this building, you all have to dial 9 to get out on your phones. And if everybody in this building picked up the phone and dialed 911, only a certain number would get out because you've only got so many outgoing lines and so many incoming lines. So that really is the crux of the definitions. And for a more technical explanation, I'm sure that the telecom folks can give you that. It took me quite a while to understand it. I had to go through it numerous times with me. And I don't know that I still fully understand it. They do, again, they update more definitions, and I'm on page 12 now in section 4. This is developing guidelines and best practices for statewide emergency 911 system training, equipment standards. The authority will develop guidelines for implementing those services and that training. And again, it's guidelines and best practices. They are not regulating 911 centers or auditing 911 centers. They are putting into place training and best practices and standards for those 911 centers to follow, and hopefully provide some, more cost-effective purchasing of equipment by just the volume, because it is a statewide entity, and it would allow for vendors for them to access 911 equipment perhaps at a lower cost. They, again, would identify mutual aid agreements necessary to make sure that there's always 911 coverage. I know there in the news lately there have been several outages of 911 down in Albany. When the tornadoes hit, there were problems with accessing 911 and the system being overburdened. We hope that this authority will help coordinate those services so that there are backups that will be available when there are those emergencies. To back up those 911 centers. Section 7, again, just lays out the beginning dates of the authority and says that as long as a 911 center that applies conforms to the guidelines and procedures, that anybody can open a 911 center. I mean, any city, any local government, it does not restrict or prohibit any government, local government, from having their own 911 center. One of the things that has been a problem is the prepaid, and Senator Kennedy alluded to this. Back probably 4 or 5 years ago, the Chairman Willard, helped us with a piece of legislation to get the 911 fees on prepaid cell phone service. And at the time, people bought the cards and would load minutes on those, and a lot of folks would do that weekly. And so there was a concern by Senator John Bullock, I remember who it was, that some of his constituents were going on a weekly basis to reload these cards, and he didn't want them paying a double fee. So we set it at 75 cents and thought that was fair. Now all plans are 30-day plans. There are a lot of prepaid plans, and all of them are 30-day plans. And so this just brings parity so that everybody's paying the same thing. There used to be a variation between Phase 1 and Phase 2 911. You could get up to $1.50 if you got to Phase 2. Everybody is at $1.50 now, so we just updated the code to reflect that. And just so across the board, the 911 fee is $1.50 a month for everybody that has telephone service that can contact a 911 center. So that will generate some additional revenue for the 911 centers. There are no 911 centers operating with a reserve. Probably all but 1 or 2 are actually pulling from their general fund to fund the 911 center. The fees are not totally funding the 911 centers. There is another provision on page 18 that people have asked questions about, and that is it does not require the service providers to list the 911 charge on the bill anymore. And if you'll note, if you see the TV commercials, they're doing a lot of advertising these days about it being no taxes, no fees, one price, one monthly price. They still have to pay the 911 fee, and they have to maintain their records in such a way that they can be audited to make sure that all of those fees are indeed paid. But it does take away that requirement for listing it on the bill. And again, those funds are kept in a restricted account, and they can only be used for 911. the bill also eliminates cost recovery. And what cost recovery is a charge that the telephone suppliers can charge back to the local government for building out their infrastructure to handle phase 1 and phase 2 911. That was one of the things that was negotiated. In order for them to get the streamlined remittance procedure and accounting procedure for the service suppliers, they agreed to give up the cost recovery, which can be up to 45 cents of the $1.50. Typically, it's running around 30 cents, and I think one company has lowered it a little bit. But so that's automatically going to be a bump in the revenue for the 911 centers, and they've agreed to eliminate billing that back to the local government. So the way it currently works is they collect the $1.50 on every line, they send it to the local government, and then they invoice them for a certain amount of cost recovery. Now, we found out this week that yours works a little differently, but everywhere else, they bill them back that 30 cents, and so that comes out of that general fund for 911.
I think it's important on this point. You talk the $1.50. If they take out that cost recovery, it comes down to either $1.05 to $1.20.
That's correct.
And by having this eliminated as far as a ability of the telephone company providers to have that charge against the $1.50 charge, there's going to be at least somewhere between almost a third to a 25% increase in
Yes.
revenues.
Yes, sir. But now, every provider does not charge cost recovery. There are only a few that are charging back cost recovery.
Did you ever get a list of who they are?
I think AT&T and Sprint are the two that charge back for cost recovery, but they'll be able, the telecom folks will be able to tell you. But I know like Verizon doesn't, and that's a fairly large provider. They have not been charging back cost recovery, so we won't be getting. I mean, there won't be an increase of 30 cents on every single line, but it will be some additional revenue for the operation of the 911 centers. We did negotiate in the bill that they would be allowed to pass that cost on to their customers. In other words, not charge the county back for it, but to charge their customer that cost recovery fee. When it went through the Senate, they put an amendment on there to cap that at 45 cents, which is what it was for local government, so that they're not charging the citizens more.
Well, question on that is, would that really be something left to the Public Service Commission to make a determination, or are we doing it by statute here, or is it appropriate in that body to make that decision?
Well, it's always been in this 911
Has it?
statute, yes, sir. And the PSC, Public Service Commission, doesn't have any of the responsibility for this, for 911. So, to the best of my knowledge, this is the only place that would be reflected and the only approval that would be needed. So, that pretty much wraps it up, except for the effective dates. It becomes effective July 1/17, and then on July 1/18, the board will be seated, and then on January 1/19, they'll start collecting the fees. I'm sorry, July 1/18, the companies will start reporting to the authority how many lines that they are billing for. They won't be remitting any money, but that will assist the authority in making sure that they've got a system in place that's going to work, and they can submit their billing practices for approval, just for a period of setup for that authority. The very last thing on the bill in Section 14 is a provision that says that this act shall not in any manner diminish, extinguish, or reduce or affect any cause of action for audits or the recovery of funds from service providers, which arose prior to January 2019. That would be that litigation that many of your counties or cities are involved in at the moment. Well, I know that was a very quick run through of a very large bill, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
I think we'll have some questions too. Leading out, Will, as chairman, let me ask you one thing. What is the amount known today that is coming in as far as 911 fees annually in Georgia?
The Cable Association pulled that information together in 2013, and it was 162 million.
162 million.
Yes, sir, and we do not have any updated figures on that, which is another reason
Yeah.
why this entity would.
So that's what, 3 years behind, you saying?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And other thing is, what current help does GEMA give? You mentioned about the grants, et cetera. Do they do work now, GEMA, for us getting applications of grants?
No, sir. There have not been any 911 grant applications in my history of being around. We have 911 directors here that can answer that question,
Okay.
but there have been no federal grants applied for, and there is federal money available. But you have to have somebody coordinating all of that information and taking care of those grants and doing the required reporting.
All right, thank you. Let me lead out with Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was writing down several questions, if I may, while Ms. Nesbitt was explaining all this to us. I just heard you answer the Chairman's question that approximately the amount of money that's brought into the current system we think is probably 160 million-ish,
Mm-hmm.
but we're not quite sure because of
Right, and that revenue has declined, is what the PSAPs are reporting, and we think that's because a lot of them have gone to these prepaid plans, and they're only paying half the 911 fee. And so the revenue has continued to go down as landlines, people are, disconnecting their landlines and just using their cell phones for a home phone, or, getting a VoIP provider. So we have seen that revenue continue to decline.
So it was much higher at one point.
We don't know because it's not, but they tell me, the PSAPs, and they'll come up in a few minutes and testify, that they have seen a decline in the revenue coming in from the providers.
So along those lines, if we're taking in about 162 million, what is the 911 system costing the state? Any idea?
Well, we
More than
did
that.
do a survey, and we pulled together some information. We still had 50 counties or PSAPs that had not reported, and it was at 220 million.
220 million to
Yes,
run,
sir.
and you still would have to add on top of that for the ones that didn't report.
That is correct.
So, and that gets me kind of to the question of how it works now. So each county only gets these fees based upon the phones that are, I guess, somehow
In their
registered in their
jurisdiction.
jurisdiction. And so Fulton County, for example, there's a lot more people that work here maybe than live here, would that be a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
So, and thus maybe a lot more cell phones, I don't know. So would Fulton County have a surplus versus places where don't as many people live have a deficit, or do we have any figures that
Well,
give us a shade on
I
that?
know that Fulton County, and actually Fulton County is here, but I know that they operate at a deficit. Their 911
deficit.
center, they do.
What about your other big counties like Cobb and Gwinnett
Cobb
and
and
DeKalb?
Gwinnett probably are close to meeting their their 911 expenses. I think Gwinnett is still doing taking some out of their general fund. Cobb is funded, but they do not have a reserve. And for a while, they had lowered their 911 fee, and that provision is still in the statute, that if you have a reserve more than 10% of your annual operating budget, you have to lower your 911 fee. And Cobb had lowered theirs, but everybody has raised their fee back up to $1.50 because nobody has a reserve.
So when we get outside the metro Atlanta, the same line of questioning, I mean, your second tier cities, Augusta, Macon, Columbus, Savannah, do we have
They
any
are
idea?
heavily subsidizing out of their general fund.
So, all right, so what about, then you get into your rural areas, what about those
They are
smaller counties?
desperate. They are facing the closure of 911 centers.
Okay. Any estimation, I think I heard you talk about, Deborah, us wondering how much we're not collecting. Did I hear you touch around that? Any
We
idea
did in
what that might be?
subcommittee, and I wanted to say too that I was very generous in those amounts, because I didn't want in any way anybody to think that we were underestimating what would be there. We think that there's probably around, it's probably going to be around 5 or 6 million in cost recovery that will be generated. In prepaid, 18 million was collected last year in the prepaid fees. Those go to the Department of Revenue. They're collected at the point of sale at the store when you purchase the phone. Just like sales tax, they go to the Department of Revenue, and then they disperse that based on a population formula back out to the counties on an annual basis. That was 18 million last year, so obviously that would double if we double the prepaid fee.
The question is now about the authority.
Mhm.
Why an authority? I know you touched on some things, but in summary, why an authority?
Well, you know, there's a history there. Obviously, when the prepaid fees were done on a formula and it was sent to the Department of Community Affairs, who was supposed to use that money to provide grants to rural areas to get Phase 1 and Phase 2 implemented in 911 services. That money for 8 or 9 years went into the general fund and was used for other purposes. We have experienced that time and again over the years with different fees and different situations. And so this is a local government service operated by local governments, and you know, the fee is imposed by resolution at the local government level. And so we feel that those are the people that are best to run this authority, are people who actually operate the public safety answering points or the 911 centers, that are imposing the fee, that can provide that coordination and that leadership.
As far as the authority is concerned, did I understand correctly that the speaker will have no appointments to this authority?
We are open to any kind of appointment methodology that you would want to put in there. This was standard, and this is what we started with. That's something that certainly you all as a committee probably know what's going to be best in that regard. So,
And last question, Mr. Chairman, this enforcement mechanism under the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act that you discussed, are we going to give this authority rulemaking power?
Yes.
So that local governments have to follow them?
well, it wouldn't be local governments, it would be service suppliers. And that's another thing I want to point out, that when we're talking about enforcement, we're not talking about enforcement against local government. We're talking about enforcement of the payment of the fees by the service providers. We're not talking about regulating local government and their 911 service.
If I could just flesh that out for me. So the rulemaking authority, if I understand it correctly, under the Administrative Procedures Act that we will give, requires for publishing hearings on such regulations. Everybody has a chance to come say their piece about it.
Correct.
We, the legislature, through the APA, have the ability to negate any rules.
You have to approve those rules, yes.
We have to approve them by
Mhm.
committees.
Mm-hmm.
Which committees would these go to?
Probably the telecommunications, energy telecommunications.
Probably, or is that outlined?
I
in
would
the-
think that's where they would go. I'm not sure.
How does one determine where one rulemaking?
Probably, but
is-
by the committee that would handle that legislation. I know this bill is here in Judiciary today, but that's not usual. Usually it would go to Don Parsons' committee, and it would go to Regulated Industries in the Senate.
But does legislation spell out which committee approves that, or is there something the APA
That we don't have
determines that?
anything in here that spells that out.
So how does the legislature know which committee approves or disapproves?
Not sure.
When I looked at this before, it was legislative
Pull your mic around, please.
I don't know if this is helpful, but I looked at this before on some rulemaking, and it was legislative council that was making a determination.
Okay.
But I don't know if
The
that's
legislative council
statutorily
assigns
an
it to a committee,
APA.
Mr. Chairman, is that what I'm hearing?
Does legislative council assign the rules that are being reviewed?
To
I
a
know-
committee to approve or
I
disapprove?
know I get them for certain bodies.
Oh, you do?
Yes, sir.
You don't know how you get assigned those,
Some of it I know is in legislation.
and that's
Some
what
of it's legislation.
I think I've seen that before. The House Committee on such and
Mhm.
such shall
Mhm.
do. Okay. So just wrapping up on that last question on the APA. So what kind of enforcement authority does the authority have against a provider who was not doing right?
Well, for example, if they refuse to comply with an audit, and the authority serves notice, then it's $1,000 a day that they don't comply. Same thing with not registering. Up to, yes.
How do you collect that $1,000?
The same way they do any other agency fine. I
Which
mean,
is?
it's paid over to I think it's paid through the administrative law judge, the place where those and then it goes back into the agency or authorities.
Well, you can
general fund.
turn that ruling of an administrative law judge into a judgment. Is that probably how one collects?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ms. Oliver?
I think 7 of us at this table are all Fulton or DeKalb.
Mm-hmm.
This bill makes a lot of sense to me for organization and data, but it doesn't sound like it solves any of the problems, or tell me if I'm wrong, that we hear about in DeKalb for the combination of City of Atlanta services overlapping into unincorporated DeKalb. How many cities in the metro area have their own 911 except for City of Atlanta?
All of them.
So City of Decatur has a 911, Brookhaven has a 911.
Yeah, well,
But they
there's
may be
Chatcom.
combined.
They may be combined. There is an authority.
There are some combined. I know Chamblee and I think Doraville may be combined, I'm not sure.
Most all of them do have 911 centers, and for those who don't, they contract with Fulton County for those services.
GMA is for this?
Yes, ma'am. They were a part of the work group, and they do support it.
Just
It's
surprised.
very rare that the groups that worked on this bill actually agree on something, which is why we would love to see the as-passed version, because it was a long process of getting us all to come to the table and agree.
But am I right that it really doesn't solve the coverage issue that's confusing?
Eventually it will. Let me tell you how. There is Next Generation 911 that is barreling towards us. It is a federal requirement, and everything will run off of a broadband instead of off of a telephone line CAD system like they're currently using. Once that occurs, then those addresses and those locators will be done through GIS, which will be a much more accurate pinpoint as to where the addresses are. We have the zip code language in here that's utilized by the Department of Revenue currently because that's all we have. But we expect that that will change in the very near future.
But you don't know exactly what near future is defined?
No, not. I mean, in the next probably 3 or 4 years. But that is the other thing that we need this authority for, is to coordinate that next generation rollout and making sure that everybody's got a system that's going to work.
Thank you.
And is that yours, Ms. Hanson?
No.
Judge, that's yours?
It
Yep.
is, Chairman.
Thank you, I recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got 2 questions. I think you had already have answered one of them. Everybody is on board with this,
Yes, sir.
and GMA
Rishi?
is, they're now on board. Is that a yes or no? Because before it was yes, but then it was
I'll let
maybe.
Rishi answer yes.
He's on the list here to come up.
Okay.
Okay, all right. And my second question, and it's been talked about to some extent in creating this authority. The Department of Revenue presently, as you say, is particularly with the prepaid phones, is already collecting the money.
Yes, at the point of sale, retail.
And so then they're distributing that out.
Yes, sir.
Well, would it be just as economical if to have an agency of government that's already existing, such as the Revenue Department, if they could do this,
Well,
to just collect and run this authority instead of creating a new political body as such?
Well, there's the issue with that is making sure that the funds are treated like tax dollars and that they're actually going back out. Nothing in this bill prohibits the authority from contracting with the Department of Revenue to collect those fees, which I fully expect that would be one of the top considerations for collecting and dispersing these fees. But you never know what the workload is at the Department of Revenue. The prepaid is dispersed on an annual basis now. This will be a monthly disbursement, and they'll be receiving money from all of the telecoms and reports, and they'll be dispersing it back out to all of the 911 centers on a monthly basis. And so it's a little bit more work. And so our thought was that the authority could then work with the Department of Revenue to come up with an MOU where they can be reimbursed for the work that they do, and they potentially could even do audits. But that's why we have the start date for 2019, so that some of those negotiations can take place to make sure that everything's in place to do the work. So they're not opposed to doing that. Again, our folks the local folks want to control this local function, and that the only way that we got them to centralize the collections, our membership, was for it to be an authority run by local officials.
Can I have one follow-up?
Oh,
Mr.
certainly.
Chairman?
Please do. Proceed.
And along those same lines, again, if you said we want to be sure that the money goes back instead of going into the general fund, couldn't we legislate that, regardless of which agency is running it, that all of those funds, other than the cost, had to go back to these agencies?
Well, there's a lot of legislation out there, and there are a lot of statutes out there that say what the purpose of money is supposed to be, but it doesn't always end up where it's supposed to go.
Well, I didn't say purpose. I said if it's mandated, this legislature can't do that.
Well, the only way you can mandate it is by constitution, unless you treat it like tax dollars, like our prepaid.
Like a local sales tax.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a local fee, and we're handling it that way, yeah.
That's thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. And just let me follow up before I recognize you, Mr. Wells. We've had some discussions in subcommittee as well as privately about this, and one of the big concerns I think I have, and I want to express it so at least we can talk about it, that's a lot of money, $160+ million going through a agency created and overseen by, well, I'm sorry to say it, but local officials primarily.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem I see is how that potentially could lead to problems. And Ms. Riley's here from Department of Revenue. And Ms. Riley, I put your name on the list here to speak, please. But they do this already with several things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they've got the mechanism, they've got the hardware, the software, the personnel. They know how to do audits,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera. So,
Mhm.
I mean, to me, we don't need to rebuild the will to accomplish what we're trying to do here. But that's one of the things we need to get into. Mr. Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Nesbitt, the current law that authorizes a 911 fee, that the imposition of a fee is at the choice of the local government. Is
They
that
have
correct?
to pass a resolution.
So if a local government wants to charge the 911 charge and add it onto the telephone lines or the cell phones, then that would be done by the local government levying that, imposing that charge. Is that
That's
correct?
correct.
So the state's not imposing these charges then?
That is correct.
They're just authorizing the locals to do it.
Correct.
The other, you had mentioned earlier, and I just wanted to try to get some more explanation on this. There's a restricted E911 account. So there's an account that local governments actually maintain and preserve, so that the funds that are taken in from the E911 charges are actually held in trust. Is
That's
that correct?
correct.
And that's a local trust account. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You had said how much was received as of 2013. With the new monies that this bill would generate, the clawback plus the additional 75 cents that creates the parity that Senator Kennedy was talking about earlier at 150, what is the total amount that you expect will be achieved if the bill was to pass, additional revenue?
Well, we can only estimate, and again, it would be 18 million in the prepaid. We think 5 or 6 million in cost recovery. And then there'll be some that will be realized by the VoIP providers that are not currently registered and paying fees. So there would be some providers, and there's no way to really guesstimate what that would be.
And currently, under the E911 statute, part of which is being amended in the proposed bill from the senator, there's already a contemplation of having a 911 advisory committee. Isn't that correct?
Well, not in this current bill. It's got the board that has a lot of the membership.
Current law.
Yeah, that was in current law. There is an advisory board, and the 911 directors are here, and so are the telecom. They are all part of that advisory board. I was part of the advisory board. Clint has been part of the advisory board. They met for years. They never did one thing. I mean, I'm just being honest. I mean, it was a group that got together and talked about all the problems and potential solutions, but nothing was ever done.
And then the other part of this is that with this new legislation, then the the authority, if it's created, it would have rulemaking authority so that it could actually promulgate some rules for enforcement. Is that correct?
With the telephone providers, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Anything from other members of the committee? I see none, so I appreciate.
Can I make one last
Please,
comment? I
always,
forgot.
Always.
I apologize. The governor had a commission to look at 911, the modernization of 911 funding and a balanced funding. Everything in this bill was in those recommendations. There were a couple of the recommendations that aren't included in here, but for the most part, all of those recommendations were incorporated into this legislation, and that was studied for 18 months, and there was an official report that came out. So I did want to say that we didn't just come up with this all on our own. There's been a lot of study and a lot of people look at this issue prior to our group getting together to come up with the actual legislation.
All right. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What recommendations from the study committee were not incorporated into this?
I would have to go back and look at the executive summary, and as soon as I said that, I thought I'm not sure which ones weren't incorporated, but I will get that. I'll get that executive summary to you and mark which ones weren't included.
If there's nothing further from committee members, we appreciate your comments, and we'll bring up others who are wanting to speak on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee.
Yes,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Debbie Vance. Ms. Vance. We welcome you. Please have a seat and pull the mic in front of you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Debbie Vance. I'm the director at Gordon County 911, and I'm the immediate past president of APCO, Georgia APCO, which is the Association of Public Safety Communication Officials.
Well, tell us what your thoughts are regarding needed changes in the 911.
I sat on the steering committee for this bill, and I am entirely support of Senate Bill 222. I'm from a rural county, Gordon County. We have a population of about 55,000. So we have a lot of concerns, and a lot of it is the amount of money that has to come out of the county's general fund to support 911. And so this bill would enable less to have to come out of the general fund. I know that there are a lot of issues because I also sit on a committee with APCO National in studying Next Generation 911 and what's coming. And it's really been an eye-opener to sit on that committee because things have come out that I would never even have thought of. But technology is just continually growing, and 911 has never really had a home in the state of Georgia. We've been under GEMA, and I'm not wanting to throw GEMA Homeland Security under the bus or anything, but nothing has ever really been done. Several years ago, they had a state 911 coordinator, and she's the one who coordinated the governor's advisory council meetings, and she worked, with the different 911 centers, but she was a state employee, so if we would go to her with a situation or a problem, she really, as a state employee, could not comment on how we should handle it. All she could do was read the law to us. So she retired for health reasons, and that position was never filled. So when Director Butterworth came on board, I contacted him and I said, are you going to hire a state 911 coordinator? He'd never even heard of the position. He did not have that position in his staff. He didn't know they'd ever had one. So they've just never.
Assume it was still funded through the budget, though.
I have no idea. I have no idea. So that's why I'm so passionate, and I know other 911 directors are so passionate about having our own authority, about having a board that only cares about 911 and is there to coordinate and to effectively put. I scribed for the subcommittees on the governor's committee to modernize 911, and I just, to be able to put all of that into place and to be supportive of 911. I mean, we just desperately need it.
Thank you, Ms. Vance. I think we have a question from Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Ms. Vance. Appreciate you being here today. Gordon County's up in North Georgia, right?
Yes, sir.
About 55,000 people.
Yes, sir.
What is the county's budget for 911?
It runs about, it's over, I'm trying to think and I can't remember, but it's close to $500,000.
About $500,000-ish.
Yes.
Now, when we talk about $500,000, when I think of 911, I think of several possibilities how money could be spent. You got to have a building. You got to have operators, obviously, so that's salaries. You got to have HR to deal with those operators. You know, who makes their paycheck, who handles their health care questions. Technology, I'm sure, is a big thing. And, of course, then you got retirement. So my assumption is, are you a sheriff's employee or a county employee or both?
No, sir. I'm a county employee. Gordon County 911 is a standalone. We're not under any other department in the county.
Because sometimes the sheriff runs it and sometimes it's a standalone. So you're a county employee.
Yes, sir.
So how did your building get paid for and how did your technology get paid for?
We have what we can pay for out of the 911 funds. So we try to budget for that.
When
The
you say
general-
can, you mean how much you have, or
If
there's
we have-
limitations on what you
yes,
can use it
if
for?
it's there. Well, there are limitations what you can use it for.
Right.
But, so if it's there, of course, that's what they'll use. If not, it has to come out of the general fund.
And what I'm probing into is that I've seen a lot of county budgets. And if the sheriff runs it, it comes out of his money. I've seen some counties build a building with SPLOST funds. I've seen other counties buy technology with SPLOST funds.
Mhm.
And so what I'm trying to get in my mind, how much is actually the money being collected paying for the system versus the system being charged, versus that money being used for, and how much of the money that's being collected is being used.
Right.
And how is it classified?
In Gordon County, all of the 911 funds are used for 911. We have never been on a SPLOST for 911. I've tried, but we've never been on the SPLOST.
For example, if the 911 director needed an SUV, could the SUV be paid for out of the 911 fees?
No, sir.
It could not.
No, sir.
If you needed a new technology system, could it be paid for out of there?
The computer-aided dispatch, yes, sir.
Yes.
The telephone, yes, sir, but not the radios.
Okay, what about your retirement? Can your retirement be paid?
Gordon
through the
County does
911
not
fee?
have a retirement program. They have a 457 that employees can pay into, and they'll match it, but that's an employee decision. We don't have a retirement
But could it be paid for out of the
program.
911 fee?
If it's worked in with the salary, I'm sure.
And I guess where I'm going, my suspicion is we got oranges and apples all across the state of who pays for what and how, and that's kind of what I was trying to figure out. Thank you.
And that's quite possible. I mean, that came out on a national level, and basically it was from 911 centers that were under the Sheriff's Department, and the Sheriff's Department was using 911 funds for the Sheriff's Department. So that has come out in the news. But I know in Gordon County, our finance director is very specific to make sure that we don't. But because we have to have general funds, you know, it's kind of a fine line of what actually is paying for what. But I know the 911 funds can pay for salaries. We do have the city of Calhoun in Gordon County. They take about 40% of our calls, and so they pay for 3 of my positions. I do up a budget for them every year, showing them how many calls we took in on a whole, how many calls were to the city for police, fire, and EMS, and they pay that portion.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Vance. I don't see other questions, so I appreciate you
Okay.
being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Next I have is David Mumford. Mr. Mumford. Please come forward, have a seat, pull the mic around and introduce yourself and with whom you're associated.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm David Mumford. I'm the 911 Director for Paulding County. I'm also the immediate past president of the Georgia Emergency Number Association, and I serve on the 911 Directors Association. Our county has a population approaching 160,000. We're a bedroom community of metropolitan Atlanta, so we see some of the same problems that we see out of metro Atlanta. And we are one of the few PSAPs in Georgia that have actually been self-funded for the last 8 years. The only reason that we were self-funded through the use of 911 fees was because of we do have an allocation in our SPLOST. And our SPLOST has been used to pay for certain technologies and the new 911 center, which we are opening up in about 6 weeks. Along with the fact that, unfortunately, we've been understaffed because the 911 centers as a whole have been understaffed, so we haven't had to pay employee salaries. So that has allowed us to be self-funded. I'm preparing an FY18 budget, which is due next Friday, and for the first time in 8 years, our budget is going to exceed the amount of money that we bring in. And that's because our staffing is up and because of the new technology that we're moving into the new 911 center. We have to upgrade our CAD system, and there's other technologies that we have to bring in. So our budget is actually going, we have to add employees also. So our budget is actually going to exceed our income for the first time in 8 years, much to the dismay of my finance director. But I say that to say that myself and the Georgia Emergency Number Association stand in support of the original version of SB 222. I sat on the steering committee that helped formulate the bill. We've worked at this for the past 3 years, and this is something that 911 in the state needs desperately. I represented Georgia at the national level at the National Emergency Number Association conferences as Georgia representative, and the next generation 911 projects that we are going to see appear in the state in the next few years. Georgia is lacking behind in that area, being able to roll this out. The authority, as written in the original bill, would help to provide some type of guidance in that direction, possibly with outlining the different types of technology that are available, and hopefully, we hope with increasing the income. So we do stand in support. My PSAP and our county, and also the Georgia Emergency Number Association stand in support of the original bill.
Thank you, Mr. Mumford. I don't see any questions. I appreciate your joining us today. Will you do it? Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Welch, you have a question.
Mr. Mumford,
Just came up.
we keep hearing the terminology, and I meant to ask this of Ms. Vance, but could you explain the next generation so that people know what that is? Because I don't know that everyone's familiar with what the next gen is.
Right.
And then there's also another thing, FirstNet. So there's a couple of things coming out from the feds that we want to understand.
I could touch on FirstNet. It's a little more than I know the basics about it. Next gen, I'm fairly good on. So right now, all of the 911 calls in Georgia and in the majority of the United States are delivered via copper wire, just your regular copper wire telephone. That's been the technology since the 1960s when 911 was first introduced. Currently, that copper wire can only deliver to us a 7-digit number, which is and voice. Those are the only two things that can be delivered. There's a lot of other information out there that can be delivered to a PSAP. For instance, if you have OnStar in your vehicle and you're involved in a crash, OnStar can deliver telematics back to the 911 centers. Unfortunately, we can't accept those. The advent of next generation 911 is 911 calls.
What are telematics?
Telematics it will be like it could tell you who's sitting in what seat, and if there was a kid in the front seat by the weight of the passenger, it could tell you which airbag deployed, where the impact occurred, if the vehicle was rolled over, the actual speed of the impact. There's so much information that can be delivered by those type of services, but the 911 centers in Georgia cannot accept that. That cannot be delivered to us over that copper wire. The advent of next generation 911, all of this information will be delivered to the PSAPs via voice over IP or the internet, a broadband connection. And this is different than FirstNet. FirstNet is from the 911 center out to the responders. Next Gen 911, which is an EZNet, that's an emergency services. There's a lot of acronyms. It's an emergency services IP network that goes from the telephone companies into the PSAPs, and then FirstNet goes on the other side. So with the advent of Next Gen, with all these calls and all this information being delivered by broadband and by fiber, the 911 center has access to all this information that we don't now. And one of the things that's important about that is the mapping. And you were talking about the confusion that occurs in jurisdictions that are close when you have multiple 911 centers in one jurisdiction. Right now, particularly with cell phones, when you place a cell phone call, it hits the nearest cell phone tower. It may not be the PSAP in the jurisdiction that you're in. The system is designed to get you to a PSAP, so that PSAP can determine your location and send it back to the correct PSAP. That's the only way that cell phones would work in our current technology.
Is that enhanced 911 system that helps to identify your location?
Phase 2. That's
Phase
correct,
2.
yes, Phase
Okay.
2. Phase 2 gives the PSAP the ability to track your location within a certain defined limit. And I think right now 300 meters is the acceptable range. With next generation, the MSAG, the Master Street Addressing Guide, and the Phase 2, they go away. And all of your mapping is done based on your actual coordinates. So your GPS coordinates, it pinpoints your location. It's a very precise method of sending 911 calls, which does not exist now. And it eliminates, well, it would largely eliminate, I can't say it would completely eliminate, but it would largely eliminate a lot of the problems with locating these calls and callers that are in the middle of nowhere that can't be found.
And under the current law, the to acquire that next gen, that would be up to each local 911 authority to purchase that next gen. Is that right?
That's correct. Currently, with the new technology rolling out, almost every piece of equipment that you upgrade to now is next gen capable. I know Paulding County, we began about 6 years ago making our PSAP next generation capable, and we are at this point next gen capable. So if the telephone company could send us this information, we have the equipment to receive it. A lot of smaller agencies are not there and may, unless we do something to assist them with funding and to help identify the technology that's best suited for them, not necessarily tell them this is the type of CAD system you need, but there's 6 CAD systems that will suit your need, which this authority would do. They may never be able to afford that technology.
And in your county, the 911 center, is it true, serves as the essential link between the caller that's calling for 911 emergency service and whoever's going to provide that first response. Is that correct?
That's correct. And we are a standalone center. We report to the Board of Commissioners. And we dispatch for our Sheriff's Department, our Fire Department, and local municipalities.
What you refer to as PSAP is not
Right, Public Safety Answering Point. That's the 911 center.
All these acronyms.
Yeah, these acronyms all the time. Full of them.
We sometimes forget that people don't know what we're
Anything
talking
further,
about.
Mr. Welch? No, sir. Thank you. You mentioned your cities. You got Hiram, Dallas. Who else in your county?
We have Brownsville. Brownsville, we don't actually dispatch for Brownsville, but those are the 3 cities in the county. Dallas has their own dispatch. We take all 911 calls, and we transfer Dallas law enforcement calls to them.
So you have, I guess, within your local governments, intergovernmental agreements about the funds coming in do they come into the county totally, or do they come into the cities and the cities give them to the county, or how does it work?
If we're the primary PSAP in Paulding County, so
Okay.
because we are the primary PSAP, the county levies the 911 fee, and the fee comes back to the county.
Okay.
If a municipality started their own primary PSAP where they took that initial call, then they would get the fees
Gotcha.
generated in their jurisdiction.
Very good. Well, thank you for coming down today, Mr. Mumford. I think the next one we have is Greg Whitaker. And Mr. Whitaker, please come forward and give us your name and identify with whom you're associated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Thank you for having me here today.
Absolutely.
I'm Greg Whitaker, the Director of Douglas County 911, and I'm the President of the Georgia 911 Directors Association. The other 2 directors, Deborah, Senator Kennedy, they've covered a lot of ground, and they've brought up many points on why this bill is needed: financial, standardization, next generation 911. They've talked in depth of a lot of things, and there's a lot of Georgia that is hurting. That not only the metro Atlanta, rural areas especially, they're out of funds. They need more funding. They need standardization with things. They need help. Next gen, as David said a minute ago, one of the things that a authority may be able to do is to break down the cost, maybe share the cost of this emergency service information network, so the rural areas can afford the next generation as well. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. I would like to say, because they've covered so much ground, that the 911 Directors Association is in support of Senate Bill 222 in its current form, and we do support it. We continue to get support for it daily. Before I came down here, I was still receiving support for it, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
How many members do you have in your association as far as local 911 providers?
As far as 911 directors, I think the last count was right at 100. if I'm not
Do they
mistaken.
pretty much represent all the 911 providers in the state, or?
It's all 911 directors, yes, sir. I can get
All
you
of
the
them
actual-
are, all of them are members, or do they require to be members? It's a volunteer association?
Yes, sir. It's a volunteer association that, for currently and for years, the three presidents, the Georgia NENA, Georgia APCO, and the 911 Directors Association, we have been sort of the agency or the central gathering information point to help all things 911. And one of the things that the Georgia Directors Association came into being was because of the need to help with centers in Georgia, as legislative issues and standard financial issues. But we are a volunteer association, so the directors come to us to ask for membership in the
Do
bill.
y'all help with training? You put out manuals? What do you do other than have greetings and meetings?
Well, that's what we talk about at the greetings and meetings. The last one we had was the Georgia, the GECC conference, which is a combined conference in which APCO, Georgia APCO, Georgia NENA is there. One thing we talk about is standards. We talked about this bill a lot. In the state, we have the Georgia Public Safety Training Center. You know, they have great training in place. We talk about that. But as far as a standardized system in Georgia, and they can tell you more about that than I can, but there's, you know, most of the Georgia laws, the 46-5 laws, cover financial and they cover funding. You know, there is not a set standard other than APCO standards and NENA standards or Georgia Fire or National Fire standards. Those are up to each individual agency to adopt or to decide what road they want to go down or what standard they want to pursue. There are some that are in place that.
Has your association been doing things at this time as far as looking at manuals, training, reviewing of equipment, what's to be recommended to your members as far as type of things that are changing? I guess I'm trying to see where is your association fit in to do things that may have been lacking with this uniformity around the state.
We do when we're asked. Anything we're asked to do, we always try to help 911 directors. That's one of the things when new 911 directors come on, they have no one to turn to. There's no training. They call us first thing and they ask what should we do, how should we do it. As far as training, again, it goes back to the local government, back to the local PSAP, how they want to do it. We have no regulatory authority. We can't force anyone to train or wouldn't. I mean, there's training in place at Georgia Public Safety Training Center, 40-hour basic mandate or 40-hour basic dispatcher course. But most of the time, what dispatchers come up to us, they're asking about funding. They're asking about, or 911 directors are asking us about funding. They're asking us about the laws. They're asking us about training, CAD systems, and we sort of work as a network for all 911 directors to reach one another so that they can share information.
All right. Any questions of Mr. Whitaker by members of the committee? See none, I appreciate you being with us today, Mr. Whitaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have next two representatives of the local government. Do y'all want to come together, Mr. Ramsey and Mr. Patel, or do y'all want to be separate?
Mr. Chairman, I just asked for a little direction. My comment was limited to a portion of the substitute, which has not been offered.
Yeah.
I think if I speak at this point, it may not be very helpful.
You want to hold up? We'll be glad to hear you on that when it's being discussed. Mr. Patel.
I am going to be unfortunate. Rushi Patel with the Georgia Municipal Association. And we agree with everyone that spoke beforehand on the version that passed the Senate. We believe that is the better version that we can be behind. That said, whenever we're in legislative process, new ideas do come forth, and in this proposed substitute, which has not come before the committee yet, there are a couple of ideas that we believe would improve the legislation. The first one is at lines 659 to 663 of this proposed substitute.
Why don't you wait until we get into that?
Okay.
I think it'd be better to hold up on as far as the
As-
concept and all of.
As far as the concept, the version that passed the Senate, we are.
Okay, let me ask you this, because it's one of the things that keeps coming to my mind, and that's about the collection of the funds. Does GMA have a position regarding the appropriateness of using Department of Revenue as opposed to having it done through a created authority or other agency to do that type of collection?
We have not run that by our legislative policy council per se, but we have worked with the telecoms and with ACCG on creating an authority for the specific purpose that the authority would be mainly comprised of local government officials making decisions on auditing and rulemaking, and we would hope that that would remain depending on the decision of the
I don't
committee.
think you answered my question. As far as what is, you're saying that would be the more appropriate way that you see by GMA to have the funds collected and dispersed would be through an authority as opposed to using the existing Department of Revenue?
I believe so.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Riley, would you want to have something, Mr. Mueller? Please. I'll give everybody an opportunity.
Thank you. Before Commissioner Riley comes up, Director with ACCG, I just wanted to directly address the issue of Department of Revenue collecting it versus this authority. As far as the collections go, obviously it's taking a return, if you will, that the telecom providers will provide with all the different counties listed that they have customers in, how much of the fee was collected in each county, then taking that information and consolidating it and cutting checks back out to each one of the 911 centers. There's not a whole lot there. That's not the complicated part, in my opinion. That's pretty easy for lots of different entities to do. I mean, we contract that out with lots of different private firms, and they could easily do that at very low cost. The more complicated piece is going to be in the auditing side. And from what we've heard, and we've looked into this, it's very, very difficult to find competent people that really understand the books of these telecom companies to be able to get in there, understand what they're looking at. In my opinion, I don't think DOR has anybody on staff that is competent in that particular area. This is very different revenue source than sales tax or income tax or anything like that. And so I think that regardless of whether DOR did it or whether we had the authority do it, it's still going to have to be contracted out to somebody that has that kind of expertise. And so we just feel like the authority controlled by the local officials that have a vested interest in this are going to make sure that they find somebody that's competent, that knows, and they may have to go do a national search for these people to come in and be able to do the auditing. But to me, that's where the complexity exists. And that's why I think the authority could just as easily handle the collections and, more importantly, the auditing as to put it with a state agency like Department of Revenue.
All right.
Yes,
Thank
thank you.
Ms. Riley, would you, at my behest, speak to the committee?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. The Department of Revenue currently collects on behalf of local governments, counties, cities, boards of educations, in excess of $4 billion each year that we collect and disseminate on a monthly basis to those respective jurisdictions. So the department has the infrastructure currently in place to be able to perform those collection services. And I will be happy to ask or answer any other questions you might have.
Well, let me ask one, and this is a question, I guess, is the security of records and information. I'm not sure what will be received by the by your department or a department, excuse me, for this information coming in. If they're sending in just dollars and saying this is what we're going to give to you, what do you have as far as showing a way to go in and verify this is the correct amount, that they have collected the appropriate amounts from all the service users, et cetera? What goes on there?
Well,
I
the
guess much like in sales tax. I use that because you got people remitting money to you from sales tax. How do you know you're getting all the sales tax? We have to go and do an audit, right?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. The department currently has the power to entertain an audit for any sales tax collector in the state of Georgia to determine the accuracy of those collections and remittances. We would envision if we were authorized and charged with this similar responsibility for this source of funding to be empowered similarly to be able to verify. We would certainly need that authority to be able to check for accuracies if refunds or overpayments were due either back to the telecom provider or whether there were corrections that needed to be made to the distributions to the local governments.
What about privacy of information that's obtained when you're doing audits?
We certainly would have to utilize and enforce the current confidentiality provisions that are in place for all transactions that we administer in the state of Georgia. So if we were to...
That you have by statute now.
That is correct. If there was a need to share information that was provided to the department by a telecom company, we would need to have that authority given to us by that company to share that information.
Sharing it with whom? A third party, you mean?
Correct.
Okay.
Any interested third party.
So if they're supplying it to you comes based upon current law as confidential information not to be disclosed by your agency to third parties through open records request.
That is correct.
Okay. Any questions of members of the committee? Let me ask one other further question, Ms. Riley.
Sure.
You do sales tax. Are there other things that are done through Department of Revenue where you're collecting and making distribution among various benefactors of that money?
Yes, we do alternative ad valorem taxes that are distributed out to the local governments, the prepaid E911 fees, sales tax, of course. Those are the ones that come immediately to mind, but the department does a significant number of distributions of taxes that are collected.
Okay. Is there anything from members of the committee? If not, we appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
I'm going to have Mr. Curtin. I want to ask you if you would mind step forward. Let me recognize you and ask you some questions. I know you've been very much involved with this whole thing for several years.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And first give you an introduction and then we'll talk about it.
I'm Kevin Curtin, and I work for AT&T.
And I guess one of the things we're trying to weigh and look at from a policy standpoint, what is the position of AT&T? I know you can't speak for all the other providers, but it'd be pretty much the same issue. This question of auditing and getting information from the telephone companies and having it clothed with a certain amount of privacy, et cetera, that comes necessary for me as a user. I don't want my information getting out type thing.
Correct. Yeah, we have that concern with all tax payments, and we're a tax collector for local jurisdictions, which then we remit today. Under either one of these two scenarios, be it new authority or DOR, we would hope that that information would also stay confidential. And the reason for that is there's competitive information that could be gained if it was disclosed externally to other parties, meaning you could do simple math and figure out how many customers we had by jurisdiction. So confidentiality of the information would be paramount concern to us.
Well, if it's not addressed as being confidential, it's open records.
Correct, and we'd have to make sure it was confidential.
Authority, the language of this authority, does it contain that type of privacy information?
I believe it does, if I'm not mistaken. I believe we included some language in Senate Bill 222 that would protect that information from external disclosure, just like you would with DOR.
Okay.
So.
And do you have a position on behalf of AT&T with regards to who does the collections or how it's to be done?
Well, we support Senate Bill 222 as drafted. We worked on this bill for over 2 years with all interested parties. There was a lot of good faith negotiations that happened. We're comfortable with the existing mechanism in 222, which is the Local Government 911 Authority. We have a lot of experience dealing with DOR, and we could adjust to that as well. So, like I said, we kind of prefer the existing mechanism that we negotiated because we gave our word that we would support that mechanism. But we do have a lot of experience with dealing with DOR, and they've done a very good job implementing the E911 prepaid system that's been in place for about 6 years.
Right. Thank you. Ms. Oliver, do you have a question?
Maybe the question is to Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure the confidentiality concern here. Obviously, I subpoena your phone, individual's phone records all the time, If an audit is conducted, that's an open.
Well, that's a court record, yeah. Court can authorize.
What
the-
confidentiality is?
Well, open
because-
records, just like somebody's curious, I'll speak of, Sprint is curious, well, how well is this company doing with their prepaids, or how well is this company doing with cell phones in a specific geographical area? They can get that information
And
if
the
they
only
ask for
other way they could get it is for an audit. An audit would be details, so, but that depends on an audit happening.
Exactly.
That's right.
We're really more worried about not so much sharing with court or with auditors, but just competitors, frankly.
All right. We thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Would you have someone else? Yes, sir. You want to speak to the committee? Come on up.
Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. Stephen Lofton with the Georgia Cable Association. I don't want to belabor the point, but we also work very diligently on this bill in cooperation with the industry, and that probably took as much work as the cooperation with the local governments, but we did get there, and we appreciate that. We do support Senate Bill 222 in its present form, and are willing to work with the committee on any changes that y'all see fit.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Do we have anyone else wish to address the committee before I close off further public comment? All right, we'll do that at this time. The matter is now in the committee. Before we go into having acceptance of motions, we'll ask, I think there is a proposal in here. Mr. Welch, you want to talk to your proposal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The proposed substitute that you have before you, which is LC 363403S for members of the committee, it essentially takes what is largely in Senate Bill 222. The major modifications deal with the governance. So let me start from the back forward. The provisions that deal with not impacting any existing litigation is still retained in this substitute. All of the language that the telecoms have agreed to, that is not altered in this proposed substitute. The main structure of the bill that revises is the governance structure, and you've heard the discussion that Senate Bill 222 will create a new authority for the state of Georgia. It would be under the state of Georgia. It would be considered part of the. Actually, we're amending part of the titles to include it within the list of authorities under the state of Georgia. It would be governed by local governance. The substitute, however, instead of creating a new authority, actually just supplants an existing committee under current state law. Current state law for the 911 statute, particularly Code Section 465123, I believe it is, creates the standing committee. It's an advisory committee. It has 3 appointees that are recommended from ACCG, 3 appointees that are recommended from GMA, 4 appointees that are 911 affiliated appointees. Taking that existing structure that's already built into the law as it stands and just renaming that as a board, the substitute changes the committee into a advisory board on statewide emergency communications. It then goes through and allocates membership to that board. The membership, as it's outlined in the sub, includes the director of GEMA, which is currently on that committee under current law, who serves as the chairman of that committee. The same is true for the board under the substitute. The director of GEMA would serve as the chairperson for the board. Also, the public safety commissioner would serve, or his designee, so whenever I say these individuals, it could be their designee, would also serve on the board. And the commissioner of DOR or designee would serve on that board as well. In addition, there's some non-voting advisory positions, if you will, from the Georgia Technology Authority, from GIPSTIC, the Georgia State Patrol Training Center, which you've heard testimony today about how they have a 40-hour training program. The authority in the Senate bill contemplates doing recommendations as to training to GIPSTIC. So having a member from GIPSTIC on the advisory on this new board would be appropriate on the advisory board. It also has 3 appointees from ACCG or recommended by ACCG. One is a 911 director, one is a police chief, and one is a fire chief. Same for GMA, same 3 appointments, recommendation appointments. Also, the Sheriff's Authority, which we also retain a position for an appointment as recommended by the Georgia Sheriff's Association. We also have a non-voting member from the Department of Natural Resources. So that's the general makeup, if you will, of the board. So it's taking what's existing current law and expanding it slightly to include some more statewide officials to be on that board. The quorum makeup is that you have to have 9 members to make a quorum. You have to have a majority of the 9 members to vote anything through. There are 7 local officials on this board, so for anything to pass, and there are only 3 voting members that are state executives, so it's still local control in terms of the board, but it does integrate the executive branch and having some advisory capacity on the board as we look at 911 communications. Then, and talk about the authority. So then we take the board, and the board is now a part of GMA. And we're giving the authority of the agency to implement all the measures that was considered in Senate Bill 222 with the approval of the board. Rulemaking authority works through the board, works through the agency. The rules that the agency would want to adopt have to be approved by the board. Any contracts, any litigation, all would be through the agency but approved by the board. So you're having a governance structure that helps to govern the activities of the agency as it pertains to 911, and those things are, and the predominant membership is local officials. That's the makeup of it. So it does not create a new authority. It takes the existing law committee and makes it into a board, giving it more powers and authority to oversee the agency, GMA's activities. The other part of the bill, changing the substitute, is that it places the disbursement and collections authority would be through the Department of Revenue, subject to a contract with the agency. So you've heard about the contract discussions, and that's also entailed in the substitute. It would allow the agency, subject to the approval of the board, to contract with DOR to collect all those revenues and disperse them out, just as they're currently doing with the prepaid wireless. So with all that said, what we're doing with the substitute is we're not creating a new separate authority. We're subsuming those powers within the existing law and existing structure, and we're setting forth all the powers and responsibilities that's in Senate Bill 222 to the agency, GMA, and the board with its approval. Those are the major changes.
What do you do with the fee situation? I think I heard before the authority approach that would have a 3% fee collected. And what does your bill do as far as looking at fees? So
the fees collected will be, the bill says 3%. The substitute has it at 2%. 1%, up to 1% could be allocated to the Department of Revenue, subject to the contract provision between the agency and the department. Another 1% would be dedicated back to the agency for its use in terms of the auditing process.
And who would have control about the oversight of budgeting and appropriation of the funds that come in under the fees?
The board.
The board of what?
The board that would be attached to GMA.
Okay, so you mean the board that is created as a part of the 911 board?
Yes.
Okay.
In the substitute, the 911 or the advisory board would have budgeting, management control, and appropriations control of that 1% that comes into the agency. And the other critical part about this is you've heard that this is a local levy, and it is. All of these charges are local in nature. The bill makes that very clear that this is a local revenue source. It is not a state revenue. So the revenues that are coming in from the 911 charge are both in current law and then more clearly expressed in the substitute are treated as a local revenue, and this is DOR under the substitute would just be collecting it just as it does with sales tax and remitting it back under the same structure that's proposed under 222. In other words, back out to all the 911 facilities that are receiving them. receiving the current funds.
All right. Any questions of members of the committee? Ms. Oliver?
This is the group that Ms. Nesbitt said didn't do anything, but you're going to enhance their authority through the substitute, where they now will be empowered to do things. That's the theory.
That's correct.
And the collection by DOR, Revenue Commissioner would have the same, not new, but it would be, the auditing authority she would have would be similar to the auditing authority she has now over funds she already collects.
Under the bill, the auditing authority
On your
would.
substitute.
Sorry, in the substitute, the auditing authority is still reserved within the board, and they can contract with whomever they want to audit. So if they want to have a private contractor, as Mr. Mueller was suggesting, as opposed to DOR, that would be up to the board with the agency. If they want to contract with DOR to do the auditing, they can do that as well.
What I'm concerned about is that it would not be the Revenue Commissioner's determination to do the audit, where she's having to compete with many other requests for audits that.
That's right. She would not.
And the staffing of this new board, which does not report to GMA. GMA does not supervise or oversee this new board.
The agency director would be on the board, and the board, essentially the agent would be working at the direction of the board with respect to 911, and it does have some language in there concerning statewide emergency communications.
But if the board chooses to contract with a particular auditor, that does not have to be approved by the GMA board.
No, it would be approved by it would be approved by the board in the substitute. Yes, ma'am.
So the main advantage of that is that you're simply not creating a new authority, but I'm trying to think through what are the disadvantages of that, if any. That's what I'm asking myself.
And I think that and we've also put language in here to state that this money would be put into the 1% that the agency would retain off of the fees would be put into trust and utilized for the purposes set forth in this substitute.
But GMA really does, this is final, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
GMA doesn't really have any authority over this board. They're just placed there because that's where they are now.
That's
Administrator,
correct.
Would they be supplying personnel,
Office
assistance,
space.
resources necessary, that type of thing?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Hanson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question, I guess, would be about liability issues, because if I remember correctly, the authority took on all of any liability issues, and they were separate and independent from the state. How does this work now with the advisory board?
The advisory board would have the same immunities and protections as any other state agency would, because it's a part of the agency.
Yeah, I was looking at, it might put a thought in here. Looking on your section 2 of the current bill, you have the listing of the authorities here. You have, and I'm going through the list here, Georgia Building Authority. That is a state authority with state appointment by usually the governor, other elected officials, state level. You have Georgia Education Authority, same thing. Georgia Education Authority for the universities, the same thing. Georgia Highway Authority, the same thing. Georgia Ports Authority, the same thing. Georgia State and Tollway Authority, the same thing. Jekyll Island State Park Authority, the same thing. And Stone Mountain Memorial Association, the same thing. The point being, these are all what we recognize as state-level authorities. You have two types of authorities in Georgia. You have a state-level authority, and then you have local authorities. Local authorities may be created by special legislation, or within the code we have areas that allow for a local government to perfect a local authority by following certain guidelines. This is sort of a hybrid to me. It's not a state authority because you don't have state officials. You've got local government officials, and it's kind of just a different fish. Part of it.
Mr. Chairman, also, if I could, because I think Representative Oliver asked some of the positives, and you know what we heard today was there's a lot of technology changes that are happening, and there is the ability for OnStar to communicate in one of the examples. If you're traveling in South Georgia and you have an accident, the ability for that local PSAP to take in the information from that vehicle may exist, may not exist. It may exist in Cobb County. It may exist in Paulding County, but it may not exist somewhere else in the state. The ability to pull down any federal funding, we've heard that doesn't happen. That would be authorized under both bills. Data collection under both the sub and the current bill. The oversight with respect to in the standardization, both of training, of technology, the ability to have interoperability between the 911 networks at the local level, that would be better served with respect to the substitute than Senate Bill 222 as written. So there are distinct advantages in having the list of purposes, intents, and powers and duties that are in the substitute, which are more expansive, and they do look at a statewide application, and they are looking at uniformity and standardization, which you've heard is not presently existing. And you don't have that infrastructure to pull down those state funds and then apply them. So I think those are advantages in the substitute that is not found in the Senate version. There's also included in here, just so we're clear, that the board, the agency with the board's oversight, would then also have the authority to go down and to examine and to look at the practices that 911 PSAPs are using statewide, and to look for that symmetry and that uniformity if it can be had, and then recommend those changes back to the 911 facilities.
To the extent we're kind of having a little bit of a,
I know.
And I don't. If all of that is accurate, it makes sense to me. But I'm looking at what I was kind of persuaded to be for the 222 was that I was going to enhance the level of professionalism. It was going to perhaps remove the politics of GEMA, for instance, and it not being a focus for GEMA, as it hasn't been apparently, and that there was an agreement. So we don't want to, because of the work, probably don't want to lose the agreement. We want to make sure, I think you've assured me, that the GEMA politics, the revolving executive director of GEMA, is not going to impact this.
Well, I haven't assured you that. In the Senate bill, in the current, the authority would be separate, its own separate entity, as opposed to being in part of GEMA.
But this committee, you're telling me, is separate from GEMA except for location. That's kind of where I need to.
No, the board would be included in GEMA, but under the Senate bill, the authority would be entirely separate.
When you say included in GEMA, but not legally included in the board of GEMA, just physically and some of the staffing, that's what I'm.
It's housed within. It's housed,
right? But not legally determined by the board of GEMA or the executive director of GEMA.
The executive director would serve as the chairperson.
And she would not necessarily have the expertise of a authority executive director that was hired solely for the purpose of being executive director of 911.
And both bills will authorize the hiring of staff to help them.
So do you have an agreement or not with that? That's it. And then I'll hush, Mr. Chairman.
Do I have an agreement with? No, we do not have an agreement. We do not have an agreement with ACCG, the telecoms, and I have discussed this, and the language is unaltered with respect to their aspects of it. I think it's a fundamental policy question as to whether or not you want to expand government and you want to add another authority to our list of state level or governments, or do you want to put this into the emergency management system infrastructure that currently exists in the state and have individuals that would be appointed that have state expertise to be a part of a system that really should operate statewide in providing protection and emergency response services statewide.
And the other way to state the policy is, do you want to enhance the professionalization of this given the complex changing technology and the huge amount of money that we're dealing with.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Welch, I'm trying to get my head around the underlying bill and also, obviously, the sub that you've put in front of us. And the first thing I would note, like I said, in the underlying bill, the speaker doesn't have any appointments to this
That's true.
agency. I'd love to see the speaker have some appointments, first of all, whichever bill we go with. Secondly, though, looking on page 8 of your sub, on line 255, when it says there, the agency, that's referring to, for lack of better terms, the creature that we're creating in this sub. Is that right?
The agency is referring to to GEMA.
To GEMA.
Yes.
So, all right, so that's GEMA, the agency. On line 255, the agency, subject to approval by the board, may promulgate and amend from time to time such rules and regulations consistent with this chapter under the Georgia Administrative Procedures Act. It deems consistent with or required for public welfare for the administration of provision of this chapter for the orderly conduct of the board's affairs. Basically, that sentence there gives GEMA rulemaking authority over all things dealing with 911 at the local level. Am I reading that right, or am I not reading that right?
It's subject to the rules of subject to the board's approval.
So do we have any such creature in law right now where a rule can be promulgated by somebody that tells your sheriff or your county commissioners how they need to run the 911 system?
No, not currently.
Do you think we need that?
I do.
What problem are we trying to solve with that?
Well, currently, the current bill says it has the exact same language in that SB 222 has the exact same language, except that it's not housed within GEMA. It would just be the authority itself. So you're still going to have rulemaking authority under either bill. It's just a question of who's going to be making it, the agency or the authority.
That's something I'd like for clarification on, Mr. Chairman, in trying to understand the underlying bill and the sub. Are we talking oranges and oranges, or apples and oranges, and what kind of authority are we in this legislation, whether it be the original bill that came out of the Senate or the sub, taken away from the local governments when it comes to running of their 911s? I don't know if you allow Ms. Nesbitt. She looks like she wants to answer that.
Where'd the senator go? A little lost sense.
He had he's coming back. He had a brief meeting.
You want to come up and speak to that inquiry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I haven't seen the current sub, but I did see the one that Representative Welch sent me last night. Under the current version of Senate Bill 222, the authority has rulemaking authority in relation to the service suppliers complying with the law and remitting the fees like they're supposed to, and the registered and registering providers. Under Representative Welch's bill, it gives them rulemaking authority over the actual 911 centers, specifically to audit, inspect, and regulate public safety answering points. That is not in the original bill. So essentially, it's giving GEMA, through the board, the authority to regulate 911 centers.
Is that what you intended to do, Representative Welch?
No. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were
Representative
asking
Welch.
Well, let me. Yes, and that in part that is true, but the language is exactly the same. If you'll look at there's Ms.
Original
Nesbitt,
bill.
Yeah, Ms. Nesbitt is not accurate in her statement as to what the current bill says in qualifying a response under line 167. I'm sorry, no, I take it back. 202, line 202, page 6. It says the board shall be subject and comply with the APA. And the agency term there, then you asked about what the powers are. The board may promulgate and amend from time to time such rules, regulations consistent with the chapter of the APA as deemed consistent with, and here's the language you just read, Representative Fleming, consistent with or required for public welfare, for the administration of any provision of this chapter, or for orderly conduct of the board's affairs. And so this language is exactly the same language that I have in the substitute. The difference is that we do allow for there to be some regulation of the local PSAPs as a power of the board. So the board can under the substitute, the board could recommend, and these are predominantly local individuals, 7 local members of the board, could recommend some policy changes, some rulemaking authority that would govern PSAPs below if they chose to. And it would be subject to the approval of the board.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, and that's, I guess, what I'm trying to drill into right now, and I could be wrong on this, I stand to be corrected, our 911 systems and how they run. If the sheriff runs it, he's pretty much in charge of how it runs, not the funding, but the running.
That's correct.
And if the county has taken it over, which they can, the Board of Commissioners are pretty much in charge of running it.
That's correct.
So, Representative Welts, and between the two of you, I'm trying to figure this out. Are we fixing to change that model potentially by your sub?
You would, yes, by the sub, you would allow for this governing board to promulgate rules that are consistent with the chapter and consistent with the sub. That would give some oversight. It would give uniformity in your training. It would give also uniformity in your technology across state if they wanted to do it, but it would be subject to the board's approval.
I want to be real clear about what we're fixing to do. We're fixing to take on the sheriffs that run these 911 systems.
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, I think there's a fundamental policy question. Do you want to have a separate authority that the state does not have any? There's no oversight in terms of any state oversight, and the amount of money that's going to go through the authority at one point, at 3%, if you take the 3%, is going to be what, $3.8 million going through this authority. Not to mention the $162 million that will also be going through the authority under the Senate Bill 222. And there's no oversight in that regard, and there's no built-in security in terms of the state. So that the funds will be routed through that authority, as compared to having it routed through DOR and with the oversight of a very similar board, but attached to GMA.
Ms. Oliver.
I'd like Ms. Nesbitt to comment on, or Mr. Welch, and then I don't know how many of these folks out here have a copy of this, so on lines 263 and 264. I'm trying to figure out what that means in terms of granting directly to GMA.
I think you were sent a copy, were you not, Ms. Nesbitt?
Is this the same as I got yesterday?
I think, is it the same?
It is the same. There were just a few changes that we made to editing. There was a department of reverence, and then also we added some language about making sure the board had appropriation authority.
So you said line
263 and 264. I'm trying to, if the agency is GMA on page 8, what does that mean? What does that language mean in terms of GMA's authority to develop a statewide public safety communication network?
Yes, this would be service suppliers in order to cooperate with them.
So GMA has the authority and not the board?
No, the board, in this case, this is just saying that the service suppliers would cooperate with the agency in development of that. And so that's the agency working with them on a network. The board, in terms of any kind of statewide, would make recommendations and help develop a plan. So you'd have that integration between state officials and locals.
I'm just trying to figure out if it really bifurcates the authority over what our intent
Not
is
this language,
to
no.
centralize the authority. I'm asking the question. Does anybody have any?
no doubt that having a statewide public safety communication network is needed and would be valuable. But that is not what we did with Senate Bill 222. It is specific to 911 centers and 911 funding and the regulation and oversight of the service suppliers paying the fees that are required under law. Not regulating PSAPs, not telling 911 centers, inspecting them or anything else. These are local fees that are imposed at the local government level for 911 services. And it was never intended to be a statewide telecommunication network.
If I might, just so that the committee is looking at this and can see the language that we're talking about that would impact and regulate public safety answering points is at page 7. It's line 237. So if the committee agrees with the structure and the policy shift and the integration of state and locals on this very important aspect, then you could strike 237, and that's the line. That's the language that she's referring to that deals with regulating, auditing, inspecting, and regulating public safety and answering points.
But doesn't relate to 263 and 264 in any way.
No, that's a different concept, and that deals with the service. That deals with the service suppliers and not the local PSAP.
I understand, but service providers that provide 911, I'm just trying to figure out wherever the word is agency is used, the agency refers to GMA, but in your view, GMA is only responding to what the board suggests to GMA. That's
If you'll look at line. So if you'll look at, let me get the right line. Line 179. There it says the agency through its director, subject to the approval of the board, shall have the power and authority to. And then all the powers and authorities that are in Senate Bill 222 are included in this sub.
But you
as well
said
as
the
other.
agency is GMA.
That's correct. It's defined. If you'll look at the other page.
Yeah, that's where I'm
Representative.
confused. How much authority are we given to the board, which operates housed in GMA, and how much authority are we given to GMA? That's my confusion.
The board only has authority through the director of GMA.
So we've created a new oversight of the board through the chairman of the board, i.e. the GMA, and its operation under law.
To exercise any of the powers that are listed under here, they would have to do it through the approval of the board. So the agency cannot exercise, the agency of the director cannot exercise any of the powers listed under this section unless the board authorizes it. So in other words, you're actually tying the hands of the agency director by requiring that agency director to go and get approval to act, whether it be rulemaking, whether it be contracting, et cetera. That all would have to be approved by the board.
All right. Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was about to do something dangerous, and that is think out loud. And I was thinking about where we are in the legislative process now. Today is obviously Tuesday.
Late.
Tomorrow is day 36 or 37.
7.
Tomorrow's 37, Friday's 38, and then next Tuesday and Thursday are 39 and 40. So we've got Thursday off and we've got Monday off. And I often go to Representative Welch when I'm trying to figure out something because he's a better lawyer than I am. And I have great respect for his thought process in this because I know he's worked in this in a lot of his legal work. And that's why I ask him questions about it. I would, however, though, probably feel more comfortable just myself as we have in front of us the original bill and the sub that, if I'm not mistaken, there are no other bills in our committee, and we would have Thursday available.
Yeah, I'm looking at what we're going to do time-wise.
Yeah, we would have Thursday available.
I'm
and
looking at what we're going to do time-wise.
could report a bill on Friday, and I would
Put it
ask that
on.
we let the parties get together and maybe talk through some of this stuff before I try to make a decision on the
Alright.
fly today. Is my thought.
What is the area of the bill you have, Ms. Nesbitt, dealing with the rulemaking authority? I looked under the powers section. I didn't find it there. Where exactly the rule? I lost it. Rule
Let
part.
me get to my original bill.
Okay. Talk about the.
Well, it's on 147, that talks about the Board of Directors promulgating laws, bylaws, and may adopt procedures governing affairs, and may be permitted or required by law to develop rules and regulations.
Okay.
And then there's more about, over on line 202, about the Administrative Procedures Act and the authority to promulgate and amend and from time to time such rules and regulations consistent with the chapter.
Okay, let me Follow up what Mr. Fleming thinking out loud. What is the thoughts and position of course, we don't have Senator here now. I prefer to have the Senator input on this issue about
He said he would be back. He had a call.
right.
I mean, a meeting.
And what I'm contemplating is maybe getting a will of the committee and seeing which way they would prefer approaching this as far as the concept of using the authority or the concept of using existing governmental body and having the board created within that body, just to see where we are. And with that thought in mind, I'm going to ask for a show of hands as to the desires to approach by the committee under the two proposals you have in your folder. The one is a proposal in the blue cover. That's the one of the authority, and the one of the Mr. Welch has been talking about. And I may add there's apparently amendments to both of these that we haven't got into yet. But I want to talk about what is the will of the committee as far as the approach to be taken. Use of the authority approach or use of a existing governmental agency and the Department of Revenue for collections. So I'm going to talk about first we'll use what I'll refer to as the Senator Kennedy's bill. All those who prefer that approach, please show by raising your right hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. And those who have, that's the correct number, those who have the approach of using the Welch approach, which is the other bill, raise your right hand. 1, 2, 3. And the 1, 2, 3, and chairs will make a tie on that, so we just don't have either decision yet. And what we'll do, you got people wanting to talk now. Mr. Holcomb.
Well, just real quickly, Mr. Chairman, it's difficult to fully answer that because we haven't had a chance to listen to the views of those who are going to be affected by it, and I know that a lot of work went into 222, about 2 years worth.
Yeah.
Conceptually, I think I lean more towards the 2.2, but I really want to hear what folks out here have to say about it before we final decision.
Which folks have we not heard from? I guess with question there.
I don't think any of them have talked in the substitute.
I think she did. Now, is there anyone who wishes from the various parties who've been involved with the preparation of 222? Mr. Norris, wish to speak on it.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Good afternoon, I'll be brief.
Take a seat.
I am Terry Norris. I'm Executive Director of the Georgia Sheriff's Association. I come here as a lobbyist, I suppose, but I actually have a job. We have about 90 folks that work with us statewide in several capacities. I have to respectfully disagree with the sub from what I've heard. The authority gave us an opportunity to keep the local control of those decisions regarding 911 centers. Sheriffs run about half, a third to a half of all the centers. And if you think about your constitutional officer sheriff, your sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer of each county. Your sheriff has the duty to protect the public, not the authority, just the authority, but the duty and the authority, according to a 1941 Georgia Supreme Court ruling. So as such, if you think about deputies being dispatched, they are an extension of the sheriff's office, to do all the things that this General Assembly has said to do for all these years. And if the sheriffs lose that ability to have a reasonable amount of control over how 911 centers work, then they essentially lose their ability to control their deputies, or could lose that ability, because you would have someone from the outside basically promulgating rules on how their 911 centers are to operate. So, no disrespect to my friend Representative Welch, it is our belief that the authority model should prevail. And as I said, it's just it's a matter of of the sheriffs being so involved in this issue. Not the fee side, because we don't see the fees, but certainly the result and the practical aspects of running 911 centers. So,
Any questions of Mr. Norris? Not? Thank you, sir.
thanks, sir.
Yes, sir. Mr. Mueller, come up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. This is a really important
Give us your name and who you're
sure.
associated with.
Again, it's Clint Mueller, Legislative Director for Association of County Commissioners of Georgia, ACCG. This is a very important policy decision here. We've got services in the state of Georgia that are hybrid services where the state controls part of the service and the county provides the other part of the service. This was a very delicate balance. We have worked long and hard with our 911 directors and other public safety officers around the state to assure them that there is some valid reasons that we need some statewide coordination, but at the same time, not giving up the local control. It was a big step, quite honestly, for our 911 directors just to get to this point, because the fear was that this would morph into the state taking over. And we were assuring them that that would not be the case, that we need the coordination, but this is a local service. We want to retain this as a local service, not to be a hybrid service between state and local government. Our feeling is if you start putting this with various state agencies, it starts looking a whole lot more like some of the hybrid services that we have elsewhere. If it's within an authority, we feel like there's some autonomy there that we can truly retain the local control here and not dictate to the 911 centers, but be leaders. It's fine to give best practices. It's fine to provide a leadership role. It's fine to provide recommendations. And I think that most of our 911 centers are good 911 centers, and they're going to follow those best practices, and they're going to want to, utilize the authority for that coordination and relying on them for training, standards, and other things of that nature. But I fear that if we get into where a state agency is starting to dictate to them exactly what they have to do, the sort of the one-size-fits-all approach, again, we lose that local autonomy. I think that's not good for this particular service. And so we, again, support the original version of Senate Bill 222.
All right.
Thank you.
Keep your seat, because I'm going to
Sure.
ask. You've heard about the question on the collection and disbursement of the funds.
Yes.
Are you saying that that should be done through a creation of this system within the authority, or use what we have as far as existing Department of Revenue abilities?
So, coordination aside, obviously not talking about GEMA, but for just a simple collection of the funds, I think that the authority could clearly look to DOR to collect these funds through some sort of a contract. Here's why I would prefer it to be a contract. We've gone down the road, we do this with our sales tax, where they're statutorily mandated to collect the sales tax revenue, and we pay a 1% administrative fee. That goes through the state treasury and goes back through the appropriation powers of the General Assembly. And we feel like a lot of that administrative money never gets back into their budget for the purpose of collecting the sales tax. So I think if there was a contractual arrangement between the authority and the Department of Revenue, then we at least have some oversight over how those collections are done. And if we we can make sure that the resources that are being put towards the collections are actually being utilized there. And then on the auditing side, as I've already mentioned, I don't know that Department of Revenue is the best entity to do necessarily the auditing. We may want to go outside, and that the authority would be able to do that. So I think we're okay with having the Department of Revenue handle collections, not necessarily do the auditing, but again, doing
Under
it by
a
contract with the authority,
A
yes.
required contract.
Yes, sir.
And I say required as opposed to a may contract. I'm saying I'm concerned, Mr. Mueller, about really close to $200 million going through this agency, this authority, and the failure of having proper controls and means of overseeing that kind of money.
Yes, sir.
I really am.
The only thing that I think we would
I really am.
we would request if it was a shall contract is there would be some way to go back and periodically look at that to make sure that the service was being provided. Because if we sole source it and there is no other, in effect, options, then we may or may not get the services that we should be getting. I just think that there needs to be a mechanism to review those services periodically and make sure that they're being done in the most efficient, cost-effective manner possible.
We gotta find a way to do that as far as make sure that this is the appropriate place. It's done right, but done through an agency that is really protecting of public monies.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, you have a question? Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller. Once again, thinking through this, how it works now, how it may work under the sub, how it may work under the original bill, and I'm going toward who controls how 911 centers work. If I understand it correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, really the county commissioners have the ultimate say-so on who controls the 911 center, because they can give that control and leave it with the sheriff, or they can take it to themselves, and that goes to Mr. Norris's comments that the sheriffs run anywhere between half and a third, maybe. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So currently the county commissioners have control. Now under the
Or
sub,
city council.
or city council, if they have their own 911 center, the local governing authority does, and sometimes they delegate that and let the sheriff do it, which is common in many places.
Yes.
So under the sub, we talked about the idea that rulemaking authority would allow this agency, GEMA, to affect that issue of how these 159 or more 911 centers are controlled. But what I'd like to drill into is under the original bill, did this agency, this authority, have that same rulemaking authority
So
to affect how a local 911 center was run? Because we read, I know I was reading language between the sub and Representative Welps was saying, hey, it's the same language right here. I thought I heard him say in the original bill.
So my understanding, and I can tell you clearly our intent, is that under the original Senate Bill 222, that rulemaking authority was only to apply to how they manage the collection, auditing, those types of those things, not at all to be used to regulate in any way the 911 centers and how they run and operate. And if for some reason somebody doesn't read it that way, we would be glad to clarify that, because the rulemaking authority under the original version was only supposed to be in regards to the collection of the revenues and disbursement of the revenues, and have nothing to do with how they, where there's training standards or equipment or any of that stuff. That is completely left up to the local level. They can, again, as I've mentioned earlier, can provide recommendations, best practices, but that would have to be voluntarily followed by the local 911 centers.
And the fine points of that very important issue of control may be something we could flesh out a little time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Law, you have nothing further? Yes, sir. All right. Thank you, Mr. Mueller. We're going to suspend any further comments at this time. I'm going to also, we're going to adjourn for the day. I think we've still got some more work we want to do on the bill. We do have a short time, and I think tomorrow, Ms. Nesbitt with Senator Kennedy, with hopefully his presence, we can sit down and get some things thought through and reworded on the bills, which are one we're going with. Okay? Thank you. We will adjourn at this time.